We continue our work at Ukraine Crisis Media Center and now give the floor to Mr. Alexander Hook, Principal Deputy Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, with weekly updates from the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. Mr. Hook, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and thank you. Last week the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine observed a volatile security situation. Although the number of ceasefire violations recorded by the SMM decreased by some 10% last week compared to the previous week, violence was observed on a regular basis in most areas along the contact line. The Yasinovata-Avdiivka Donetsk airport area was the focus of much of the violence, with 40% of all ceasefire violations last week recorded there. Areas east and northeast of Mariupol accounted for about 30% of all SMM recorded ceasefire violations. Dear friends, this week's marks the third anniversary of the signing of the Minsk Memorandum. It is worth recalling what the provisions of the memorandum are. The sides agreed to cease fire. They agreed not to move beyond the positions they held on 19 September. They agreed not to use any type of weapon. They agreed to withdraw weapons with caliber higher than 100 mm, and they agreed not to plant mines and also to clear existing mines. 3 years after the sides have signed what was effectively a ceasefire agreement, the OSCE SMM recorded 1,882 ceasefire violations last week. We also noted heavy weapons in violations of agreed withdrawal lines 74 times. We continue to see armed men and soldiers in close proximity, the result of forward moves since the signing of the memorandum. In particular, we noted forces and formations very close to one another at Stanitsa-Luhanska Bridge, where both sides 1 year ago specifically committed to disengaging. Our monitors also saw mines all along the contact line last week. For three years now, all sides claim they are implementing the Minsk agreements. At the same time, the sides violate these agreements. This reality is evident to the readers of the SMM daily reports. But for the hundreds of thousands of people living along the contact line, it is their daily reality. Last week, the OSCE SMM released a thematic report on civilian casualties in 2016. I recommend it to anyone wishing to understand the human cost of the sides' continued failure to make good on the promises they made this week 3 years ago. In particular, the report highlights that 33 of the victims were children, almost half of whom died from or were injured by mines or unexploded ordnance. Some of the victims were not even born when the Minsk agreements were signed, killed or injured by men who insist they are not engaged in violence. If the sides are adhering to the ceasefire, if they're complying with their commitments, who then is responsible for the death of the three brothers, for instance, who died in their home in Yanikev in June last year? The older of the two were aged 5 and 11. and their younger brother was a mere 1.5 years old. He was not even alive when the ceasefire was agreed by the sides. He never saw a single day of peace in his short life. Dear friends, the killing of the innocent continues. The SMM has in fact been recording higher numbers of civilian casualties this year than last year. So far this year we have confirmed 387 civilian casualties, 68 deaths, 319 injuries, an 18% increase to the comparative figure of 2016. There is, I fear, after 3 years, a tendency to think of what is happening in Donbass is normal, especially among the young who have known nothing else or very little else. For them, schools barricaded with sandbags have become the norm. Bullet holes in their bedroom windows are not uncommon. Unexploded ordnance in many of their playgrounds is a reality. I can understand how people living with this violence, particularly children, internally normalize the abnormal. Often it is their only coping strategy. There is, however, also a tendency among many people not directly affected by the violence, usually living far away from it, to accept this violence. For them, there is an acceptable level of violence. This mentality is, I think, contributing to the continued violence. We must not accept this. There is no acceptable level of violence. There is no acceptable level of violence. Accepting it, thinking that a certain level of violence is acceptable, undermines efforts to end it. Ending the violence is possible, as the sides have shown on a number of occasions. When they decide to stop, the violence stops. All it takes is the will to do it. That will, however, does not exist among all people in positions of power, because they think in terms of an acceptable level of violence. Dear friends, yesterday marked the International Peace Day. It is, as the chief monitor of the OSCE SMM said, an opportunity for the sides to renew the commitments they made in Minsk 3 years ago. However late it is, in fact 3 years too late, the sides must take this opportunity. They must do what they promised. It is time that they rejected an acceptable level of violence. It is time that children can play without fear or minds and unexploded ordnance, that they no longer need to sleep in cold, dark basements, sheltering from shelling. It is time for them to be children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Dear colleagues, if you have questions, please, you're welcome. The question will be in Ukrainian.
Crimean News. It was reported that the OSCE SMM would install additionally 4 video surveillance cameras in September, in addition to the existing 7 cameras, 3 on our side and 1 on the side controlled by militants. My question, whether you installed those cameras and where, and are there any debates about the installations of video surveillance cameras on the unsecured border area between Ukraine and the Russian Federation? Thank you.
Thank you. I can confirm that the installation of new cameras continues. We have by now established a new camera at Pishevik, Majorsk and Marinka entry-exit checkpoints, as well as on the southern side of the Stanica Luhanska disengagement area at the location of the Prince Ihor monument. More cameras are planned, and you will find the results of what these cameras record in our daily reports on our website. There are no plans at this stage to install cameras beyond the contact line. However, we are ready to continue to expand our technological capabilities, provided those that are in control in these areas let us do so. I would like to make the point here that no matter how many cameras, no matter how many observers on the ground, no matter how many UAVs we put in the air, if the sites do not want to stop it, it will not stop. Our task is to document whether they stop, but it's the site's responsibility to end this. And I would also like to remind you that the cameras have been put there because we can't be there because the sites do not allow us to be there. Thank you.
One more question.
Good afternoon, Ksenia Dvornikova, Fifth Channel. I have two questions, actually follow-up questions to what you reported today. At the beginning of your speech, you have told that the number of shelling decreased. However, the general level of violence increased. Can you shed more light on this? Probably you have recorded increased number of civilian casualties. What does that mean? What do you think so?
Last week, compared to the week before, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has registered a decrease of the overall violence by 10%. So that's last week compared to the week before. Still, in the entire week, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has registered 1,882 ceasefire violations in total. And on a separate note, yes, it is correct. In the period from 1st of January to now, the Special Monitoring Mission has corroborated 387 civilian casualties. In the same period last year, the figures were 18% lower.
І ще одне уточнення. Ви сказали
And one more clarification that you have noted 74 times the weapons in violation of agreed lines. Could you specify on which sites have you noted those violations? And you would probably specifically say how many violations were by the opposing side. Thank you, if it's possible.
Thank you. The details you will find in our daily reporting. We list them every day in a section called Weapons in Violation of Withdrawal Lines, and thereunder you will find the exact description of it. If I would have to list 74 heavy weapons here, and they are found on both sides of the contact line, it would take me half an hour to go through. It is unfortunate that the sites, despite claiming they're implementing Minsk, they're still violating it, and in this case 74 times. I repeat again, the sites are claiming they're implementing Minsk. I ask myself, and so do our monitors, why are we registering still 1,882 ceasefire violations, and why we still see, last week, 74 weapons in violation of the agreed withdrawal lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Do we have more questions? No more questions for today? Oh, one more.
Probably another qualification, the report published last week, and you reported that the SMM saw near Uspenka, if I am not mistaken, a helicopter, military-type helicopter. Could you please specify this appearance of a helicopter is considered the violation of the Minsk agreements, and could you please shed the light on whom the helicopter is attributed to?
Thank you. It is not for the mission to draw conclusions based on its findings. We report what we see or what we hear, and in this case we have seen that aircraft. It is for the sites or those who are responsible to provide you with that answer. I can only reiterate the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission's task is to document what it sees, and conclusions drawn by it, which it cannot do by itself on facts observed, it will not do, but it is left to the readers of our reports. Thank you.
Я просто хочу, вибачте,
I would like just to clarify whether the appearance of helicopter, of the flight of a helicopter in line with the Minsk agreement that were signed 3 years ago, whether this flight of a helicopter is considered a violation of the Minsk agreements. Because it is known that UAV flights are not allowed, and the aircrafts are not allowed to fly, and whether this helicopter flying there is a violation of the Minsk agreements. Could you confirm that?
Okay, thank you. I can only repeat what I've said before. We are not concluding on issues where we have no evidence to do so, but you, of course, are very familiar with the agreements themselves. You take the facts that we present in our reports, you compare to the agreements, you are free to conclude on this. We don't unless we have the facts that would support such a conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. It seems we have no more questions now, so we'll end the press conference. Thank you.